how do you overcome internet addiction?
Okay, so thank you for that. I think that's kind of the elephant in the room, if you will. That's that kind of a question because it's such a broad question, but one that's very, very important for everyone who's listening in on this webcast. So overcoming internet pornography is a unique process, not because it's not because addiction itself is something that we haven't really learned much about. We have learned a lot about addiction, but because the nature of internet pornography is unique in terms of the ability to promote an extreme response in the brain. Internet pornography has several factors that cause it to be very unique as an addictive cause, if you will. One is that it's always available, always accessible. Another is that it is anonymous. Another is that it presents such a huge variety that is available. For all intents and purposes, anything that you can imagine that has a sexual or pornographic connotation is available on the internet. And so, and you can access it, as I said, anytime, any place, anywhere, and you can do so anonymously and without limitation. And so, because of that, we often refer to it as the perfect poison because it's so powerful and so prevalent, and it can invoke such a hugely powerful response in the brain that it becomes a very, very addictive behavior. So the process of overcoming that, it's a very in-depth answer, first of all, I would say, because there are certain components that are similar for all people, but there are many components that are going to be different for everybody. One of the things that is definitely directly involved in overcoming internet pornography is finding ways to manage the intense triggers that come along with that, being able to address those so that you find other healthy behaviors. So managing that addictive behavior becomes a process of essentially vigilance, if you want to refer to it that way. If you're vigilant of an urge, and you know that it is something that can easily be acted upon, you'll have to find a way, usually with some help, to be able to manage those intense triggers because they will come, and especially because they're so prevalent. And again, all those factors I mentioned about the internet aspect of internet pornography, it's very prevalent and a very big challenge because of that. So I think managing triggers is a huge part of recovery. That involves recognizing those triggers, recognizing circumstances in which the triggers are more likely to have impact on you. It also involves, I think this kind of leads into the second question, which, if I remember correctly, it related to how can I replace that behavior. One of the important ideas around recovery is that really there's not a true replacement for something as profoundly effective as internet pornography in terms of the impact it has on the brain. So what we're going to try to look at is, instead of replacement, we're going to look at what can I do to enable myself to be okay with more natural chemical responses in my brain, instead of trying to seek something that is basically the equivalent of a dopamine rush, much like drugs, like heroin. Instead of trying to say I'm going to replace that, we would look at the idea of what can I do to help my brain start to be okay with a normal amount of dopamine in my life, with normal behaviors, such as a normal sexual experience with my spouse, such as normal rewards kinds of experiences that come in life. Learning to be okay with those kinds of responses is a very long process when you're accustomed to the power of internet pornography. But that is something that, the idea of replacement Honestly, the replacement factor really isn't there because of it's such a tremendously powerful thing. But your brain can heal from that. It can recover from the need, the desire, the urging for such a high chemical response to the point where you feel like you can manage and that you feel peaceful and content and happy with the more normal, typical kinds of chemical responses that happen due to normal daily activities. Tony, what was the third question on that?
The third question is, can you suggest some trigger response plans for any addiction like porn, sex, internet, etc.?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. Because, as I mentioned in response to the first question about one of the keys to recovering from internet pornography abuse is being able to recognize and manage triggers. Some suggestions that I would give regarding being able to deal with those triggers is, well, first of all, I think the first key to that is being able to recognize the triggers for what they are. So a plan would be to start practicing recognition, first of all. What am I seeing as a first step in the trigger of the desire to use pornography or masturbate? We can, if we're careful and we take a close look at the situations and the environments of the decisions and the emotions that we feel in that process, we can usually trace that back to something that is a trigger. And that's definitely a huge part of managing those triggers, is being able to see what it is to begin with, because we may not recognize it. Now, in the case of being able to recognize that, once that is in place, I think one of the next steps, one of the suggestions I would have would be to have a specific plan in mind for when that particular trigger is experienced. An example would be, let's say I recognize that I often feel triggered if I am surfing the internet or if I'm on social media, for example. If I see videos on YouTube, or if I see images on Facebook or something like that, and those are triggering to me, and I know that because I've experienced that many times, I can have a plan in place to be able to address that, knowing that it will have a very serious impact, knowing that the trigger sets in motion things that are very powerful inside of my body and my brain, and that once I start down that road, it's very difficult to come back from that. So a plan might be to contact somebody that's close to you. For example, let's say I'm a young man who is struggling with a trigger, and I want to reach out to somebody. I might have a best friend or a series of close friends who I can simply call or text, and I can say, hey, I need to talk for a minute. I need a little bit of support right now because I'm having a difficult moment. Depending on your openness and your level of trust with that person, you may or may not get into the actual details of why you need some support. But you could simply reach out and say, hey, I just need someone to talk to for a minute. Can you just be with me? Can you just be there for me for a few minutes, and let's just hang out and talk on the phone, let's get together, whatever. So reaching out to somebody close to you who is prepared for that kind of situation would be a very good thing to do. Another suggestion would be, let me call out a different scenario. Let's say that every morning when one gets in the shower to get ready for the day, that is a triggering moment. That is a common scenario that I hear from a lot of individuals. And so if that's a triggering moment, think about some of the steps that you can take, knowing full well that that's going to be powerful for you in that moment. So one step might be, okay, I'm going to shorten my shower. I'm going to get in and out very quickly because I know that as I remain in the shower, the trigger's going to be there longer, and the chances are that I'm going to be facing, increasing challenges in trying to overcome that trigger. So that's one example of something you might do. Another example might be to change the pattern. I might say, well, I'm going to take a bath instead of a shower, if that's something that could be helpful. I'm going to set an appointment that's going to require that I act quickly in preparing for the day, so that I'm not in that environment too long. That could be potentially triggering. So I'm in the shower at 7:30, and I have a responsibility that I have to attend to, whether it's a phone call or a meeting or whatever, at 7:45 or 8 o'clock or whatever, so that you've got something that's going to press you to use your time well, and you're able to manage that trigger more effectively. Those are a couple of suggestions for you on how to deal with some of those triggers that are very common.